1881, in the redwood forests near Eureka, California, a lumberman named John Dolbear built a squat little steam engine on a sled of timbers and used it to do something no animal on Earth could do. He dragged a giant redwood log across the forest floor on a cable by steam, faster and cheaper, and more tirelessly than any team of oxen ever could. He called it a donkey engine, because next to the great engines in the sawmills it looked small, a beast of burden for the donkey work of the woods. Within 20 years there were hundreds of these machines screaming in the forests from California up to Washington, and the long age of the ox and the timber was over. One machine, built by one man in one redwood town, changed the way the entire West Coast brought down its forests. I've been reading the histories of West Coast logging and the story of the donkey engine, and as always, I want to begin with the names the record kept, and to be honest about the ones it did not. The first name is John Dolbear. He was born in New Hampshire in 1827 and went west, like so many, in the rush of the 1840s and 50s, and ended up in the redwood country around Eureka on the foggy northern coast of California. There in 1863, he went into partnership with another man and founded a lumber company that would become one of the largest redwood operations in the world. Dolbear was the mechanical mind of the partnership, an inventor as much as a lumberman, a man who held patents on several devices. And in the summer of 1881, in the woods near Eureka, he built and tried out the machine that would carry his name into every logging camp on the coast. Eureka sat on Humboldt Bay, a deep harbor on a wild stretch of the northern California coast, cut off from the rest of the state by mountains and reachable mostly by sea. It was redwood that built the town, and redwood that it lived on, the logs coming down out of the hills to the mills on the bay, the cut lumber going out by ship to build San Francisco and the booming towns of the West. Dolbear and Carson's company was one of the giants of that trade, and Dolbear himself was the kind of restless mechanical mind the age threw up. Again and again, a man who held patents on several inventions, and was forever tinkering at the practical problems in front of him. The donkey engine was the one that mattered, but it came out of a lifetime of that habit, of looking at a hard job and asking whether a machine could do it better than muscle could. The second name is William Carson. Carson was Dolbear's partner, and if Dolbear was the inventor, Carson was the empire builder. Born in Canada in 1825, he came to California in the gold rush, turned from gold to timber, and in 1854 shipped some of the first loads of redwood down to San Francisco. With Dolbear, he built the firm of Dolbear and Carson into a giant, cutting something like 15 million board feet of redwood lumber a year by the 1880s. The fortune Carson made from those redwoods built a house so extravagant that it is still today one of the most photographed Victorian mansions in America, the Carson Mansion, standing in Eureka as a kind of monument to what the redwoods were worth. These two are our anchors, Dolbear, who built the machine, Carson, whose redwood fortune shows you the scale of the thing they were doing, and behind them both stood the men who actually ran the machine in the woods, crews whose names the record almost never kept. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Well, to understand why a machine like this mattered so much, you have to understand the timber it was built to move, because the forests of the Pacific coast held the largest trees on the planet. The coast redwoods of Northern California are the tallest trees on Earth, rising more than 300 feet. Douglas firs of the Northwest are not far behind. A single one of these giants, cut into logs, could weigh many tons per log, far more than the great white pines of the East. And these trees did not grow on flat, friendly ground. They grew on steep coastal slopes, fog and rain, in soil that turned to deep mud half the year, the ground a chaos of stumps and brush and fallen timber. The trees were the biggest in the world, and the ground they stood on was about the worst you could ask to move them across. It is worth pausing to feel the scale of these trees, because nothing else in the American forest compares. A coast redwood takes 400 or 500 years just to reach its mature size, and the oldest of them have stood for more than 2,000 years, since before the Roman Empire. The tallest tree ever measured on Earth is a coast redwood, more than 360 feet from root to crown, taller than a 30-story building. These were not trees in the ordinary sense. They were living towers, older than nations, and a logger who cut one was cutting down something that had been standing since the time of Caesar. To bring one of those to the ground, buck it into logs, and then move those logs, each weighing many tons across a steep and muddy slope, was a problem on a scale that the eastern loggers, with their merely enormous white pines, had never quite faced. And consider what it took just to put one of these giants on the ground before it could be moved at all. because the base of a redwood flares out wide and is often pitchy or unsound at the very bottom. The fallers did not cut at ground level. They drove springboards, narrow planks, into notches chopped in the trunk 8 or 10 feet up, climbed onto them, and stood balanced on those boards to swing their axes and work the saw into the better wood above the flare. 2 men might spend days on a single tree, chopping a deep undercut on the side they wanted it to fall, pulling a crosscut saw longer than a man is tall through from the back, driving in wedges to hold the cut open. At last the giant began to lean, and then to fall, and came down with a concussion you could feel in your chest a quarter of a mile away. The buckers sawed the fallen trunk into logs, and a single great redwood could make many logs, each one a load in itself. Only then, with the tree down and bucked, did the problem the donkey engine was built to solve even begin. Problem of how to drag those logs out of the woods. And the prize was worth all that effort, because redwood is a remarkable wood. It is light for its strength, straight-grained, easy to work, and it resists rot and insects and fire far better than most timber, which made it some of the most valuable building lumber in the world. Redwood built much of San Francisco and the towns up and down the California coast, the houses and the water tanks and the railroad ties and the wine casks and the foundations, anywhere people needed wood that would last in damp ground. A great deal of the 19th century West was built out of these trees. So the pressure to cut them, and to cut them faster, was enormous. And it is against that pressure that you have to understand why a machine that could move redwood logs more quickly was worth a fortune to the men who owned the forests. For decades, the loggers solved it with oxen. Great teams of oxen, what they called bull teams, 6 or 8 or 10 yoke of them, were driven into the woods to drag the logs out. To give the logs something to slide on, the men built skid roads, lines of half-buried logs laid crosswise like railroad ties, and a man called the grease monkey ran ahead slathering them with grease or oil so the logs would slide. Bull team would be chained to a string of logs, and the teamster, the bull whacker, would drive them bellowing down the skid road, dragging tons of redwood behind them. It worked after a fashion, but it was slow, it was enormously expensive to feed and keep the animals. Oxen were strong, but they tired and they needed rest. And when the winter rains turned the ground to soup, the bull teams bogged down and the work could grind to a halt. The greatest timber on earth was being moved by the patience of oxen. Oxen had limits. The skid road itself was a piece of work. The men laid down logs crosswise in the path, half buried and spaced like the rungs of a ladder, to make a track the great logs could slide along instead of plowing through the dirt. And a man called the grease monkey went ahead of every haul, smearing those cross logs with animal tallow and grease so the load would glide and not bind. The bullwhacker walked beside his team with a goad and a fearsome vocabulary, keeping 6 or 8 or 10 yoke of oxen pulling together in rhythm, because if the team did not pull as one, chain would snatch and something would break. It was a whole craft, the bull team and the skid road and the grease and the shouting that had moved the timber of the coast for a generation. But it was slow, and the animals ate whether they worked or not, and a sick or injured ox was a dead loss. And when the winter rains came and the skid roads turned to channels of mud, even the grease could not save it. The work crawled, and in the wet season it often stopped. That phrase, as by the way, the skid road, is where we get the modern term skid row, because the rough end of the lumber towns, where the loggers drank and slept, grew up along the real skid roads. John Dalbeer looked at those limits and built a machine that had none of them. Stay with me at the boss tier while I show you how it worked. For $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to the woods. Dodd Dalbeer built in 1881 was simplicity itself, which is why it worked. He took an upright steam boiler, the kind that burned wood and made steam, and a single-cylinder steam engine, and he mounted them together on a heavy sled made of squared timbers, so the whole thing could be dragged from place to place and would sit solidly on the forest floor. The engine turned a drive shaft, and on that shaft was a spool, a kind of capstan that the loggers rates came to call the gypsy head. Around that spool he wound a long rope, in the first machine a manila rope about 150 feet long and 4.5 inches thick. You would run the free end of the rope out into the woods, wrap a choker around a fallen log, and then the engine would turn the spool, winding in the rope and dragging the log across the ground, over the stumps and the mud, all the way back to the machine. The whole rig was about 12 feet long and 6 feet wide and weighed something like 4 tons. Could pull hard enough to snap that 4.5-inch rope like a thread. Dalbeer patented it in 1882, a tireless mechanical ox that never needed feeding, never needed rest, and never bogged down in the mud because it did not walk. sat still and pulled the forest to itself. Here is the clever part, the part that shows Dolbear was a real engineer. The machine sat in one place and reeled the logs into it, but then the rope had to go back out to the next log, and a heavy rope does not walk itself back into the woods. So in the early days they used a horse, a single animal called the line horse, to drag the loose end of the rope back out to where the next log waited. One horse, doing the light work of carrying a rope, in place of the whole bull team that used to drag the logs. Later the engines were built with a second spool that hauled the rope back out by steam, too, and the horse disappeared entirely. The animals had been replaced. A job that had taken a great team of oxen and several men now took a steam engine, a coil of rope, and a small crew. That crew is who I want to talk about now. The donkey engine created a whole new set of jobs in the woods, with their own names and their own dangers, and the men who held them are almost all anonymous to us. There was the donkey puncher, the man who ran the engine. There was the choker setter, who went out and wrapped the cable around each log. Dangerous work, because once the engine took up the slack, that log came alive and moved. A man caught in the bite of the line, or between the log and a stump, could be killed in an instant. There was the spool tender, guided the rope as it wound. And most famous of all, there was the whistle punk, usually a boy, whose job was to relay the signals. The choker setter, far out in the brush, could not be seen or heard by the donkey puncher at the engine. So the whistle punk stood between them and worked a whistle wire, blowing coded signals on the engine's steam whistle, 1 blast to go ahead, 2 to stop, telling the engine when to pull and when to hold. A boy on a whistle wire stood between a snapping cable and a man's life. It was a system invented precisely because the work was so lethal, and the record gives us the jobs, the whistle codes, the dangers, and almost none of the names. The ledger gives most of these men no name, only a number and a day's pay, and lethal is the right word. Logging on the West Coast in the steam donkey era was among the most dangerous work in America, and it remains, even today with all our modern safety, one of the deadliest jobs there is. The cables ran under tremendous tension, and a wire rope that parted under load could whip back through the air and cut a man in half before he heard it snap. Logs being yarded in could roll, or swing and crush anyone in the path. The boiler could fail, a choker could slip. The men worked in the rain and the cold and the dark of the deep forest, far from any doctor, and when a man was killed, and they were killed often, the work usually went on. The whistle punk's coded blasts and the choker setter's hard-learned habits of where to stand were not bureaucracy. They were the thin line between a working day and a funeral. We remember the machine and its inventor. The men who fed it, who set the chokers and read the whistles, and climbed the spars, are mostly a blank in the record, a wage and a job and no name. If you could stand in those woods in the 1890s, the sound alone would tell you the whole story. Gone was the bellowing of the bullwhacker and the creak of the ox yokes. In their place was the steady chuff and hiss of the steam donkey, the shriek of its whistle carrying the punk's coded signals through the trees, the groan of the cable as it took the strain, and then the crash and slither of a great log coming in through the brush. The American forest, which had been worked for 2 centuries to the sound of axes and animals and men, now ran to the sound of steam. It was the sound of one whole way of working passing away and a faster, harder, more mechanical one taking its place. And you could hear it coming a ridge away. The men who made that sound lived in rough camps deep in the timber, far from any town, bunkhouses thick with the smell of wet wool and pipe smoke, fed enormous meals by camp cooks because the work burned a man up. They were a roving, hard-living, mostly young population, drifting from camp to camp and outfit to outfit, many of them immigrants, with Scandinavians and Finns especially common in the northwest woods. They worked from before light to after dark. They were paid by the month, and they were proud in the way of men who do dangerous, skilled work, of being able to do a thing that would kill a careless man. A logging camp was its own small world with its own slang and its own pecking order, bull of the woods at the top and the green chore boy at the bottom. And a man could spend a whole working life in that world and leave behind no more trace than a name briefly entered in a time book. They are the people who actually brought the great trees down. They are, almost to a man, nameless in the record. The ledger kept the board feet, it did not keep them. Before I tell you how far this machine spread, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one unless enough people click, one click, and then come right back. The donkey engine spread through the West Coast woods with astonishing speed, because every logging outfit that saw one understood at once what it meant. It was faster than oxen, it was cheaper to run, it worked in the rain and the mud that stopped the animals, and it could drag logs up and down slopes that no bull team could manage. By the year 1900, less than 20 years after Dolbear first tried his out near Eureka, there were nearly 300 donkey engines working in Washington alone, several dozen more in Oregon, and dozens in California. The age of the bull team was ending, and the age of steam-powered cable logging had begun. And the machines kept getting bigger and more capable. Loggers learned to lift the front of the log up off the ground by running the cable through a block high up a tall spar tree. The logs could be flown in over the brush instead of dragged through it, a technique called high lead logging that the donkey engine made possible. That technique created one of the most spectacular and dangerous jobs in the whole history of American work, the high climber. To rig a high lead show, the crew needed a tall, strong tree near the donkey to serve as the spar, the high anchor for the cables. And someone had to climb it, a man with spurs on his boots and a rope around the trunk, working his way up a living tree a couple of 100 feet into the air, cutting off the limbs as he went, and then, at the very top, sawing off the entire crown of the tree while balanced up there in the wind. When the severed top finally broke free and crashed to the ground, the whole great spar would whip back and forth through the air, with the high climber still clinging to it, 200 feet up. Breathtaking, and it was lethal. And the men who did it were a special breed even among loggers. West Coast logging in these years was one of the deadliest trades in the country, and the high climber's job was the sharp edge of it. The bigger road engines could drag logs a mile or more, and the whole thing traced back to that first squat little 4-ton machine on its timber sled in the redwoods. The machines themselves grew up fast. Dolbear's first donkey had pulled with a thick manila rope, same stuff as a ship's rigging, but rope frays and rots and snaps, and the loggers soon switched to wire cable, rope that could take far more strain. The single small spool became multiple powered drum drums, one to haul the log in, and another to throw the line back out, so the line horse was retired for good. Engines were built bigger and bigger, with more cylinders and more power, the giants of them called bull donkeys or rotors that could drag a string of logs a mile through the woods. Whole forests came to be logged by a web of these engines and cables, the logs flying in along the wires to a central landing and then onto railroad, cars, or down to the water. In the space of a few decades, the donkey engine had reorganized the entire geography of how timber was cut on the coast. All of it had grown out of that one first machine. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. You want it? The link is in the description. It is worth pausing on what all of this was in service of. The donkey engine did not just make logging easier. It made it faster, and faster logging meant the great forests came down quicker. The fortune that William Carson made from redwood, the fortune that built that famous mansion in Eureka, was the fortune of a company cutting 15 million board feet a year, and the donkey engine was part of what made cutting at that pace possible. There is a wonderful detail about that mansion that tells you something about the man and the trade. Between 1884 and 1886, and by one well-known account, he put it up in part to keep around 100 of mill workers and craftsmen employed through a slump in the timber business, worked to keep good hands busy and fed when the market sagged. So the most elaborate Victorian house on the Redwood Coast was, among other things, a make-work project for out-of-season loggers and millwrights of the very redwood they cut. It still stands in Eureka today, all towers and turrets and carved gingerbread, a private club now, and it is the single most photographed monument to what the redwoods were worth and what the men who cut them could build with their hands. The coast redwood forests, like the white pine of Michigan before them, were treated at first as though they could never be exhausted. The machines that brought them down so efficiently helped prove, over the following decades, that they could be. Most of the original old-growth coast redwood was cut. What survives today, the great cathedral groves that people travel across the world to walk through, is a small fraction of what once stood, preserved at the last moment in parks and reserves. Only a remnant of the original old-growth coast redwood was ever saved, set aside in the early 20th century by people who realized almost too late that the tallest and oldest living things in the country were nearly gone. When you walk one of those protected groves now and crane your neck up a tree that has stood for 2,000 years, you are looking at the exception, tiny fraction that the saws and the donkey engines did not reach in time. The donkey engine is part of that story too, tool that helped take down the largest trees on Earth at industrial speed. And like every machine in these stories, the donkey engine had its season and then it passed. It ruled the woods for about 50 years. The same march of technology that had replaced the ox with the steam engine eventually replaced the steam engine too. The internal combustion engine arrived, and the diesel and gasoline crawler tractor which could drive right up to the log and drag it out, and then drive somewhere else, made the stationary steam donkey look slow and fixed in its turn. By the 1930s, the steam donkeys were going cold and silent, hauled off to rust or cut up for scrap, replaced by machines that did not need a fire and a head of steam to start the day. The men did not vanish as the machines changed. The crews who had run the donkeys learned to run the tractors and the diesel yarders, and the dangerous, skilled trades of the woods, the faller, choker setter, the rigger carried on under new power. What ended was the steam itself, the wood fire, and the boiler, and the slow build of pressure in the cold morning before the first log of the day could move. For half a century, the forests of the coast had run on that, on fire, and water turned to steam, and steam turned into pulling power, and then quietly, one camp at a time, the fires went out. John Dolbear did not live to see most of it. He died in 1902, only about 20 years after his invention, having watched it spread across the coast but not having seen it fade. William Carson lived until 1912, the Redwood Baron in his Redwood Mansion, and the company they built went on for many years more. The machine did not entirely disappear, and here is a small grace. Because the donkey engine was so important to the history of the West Coast, examples were saved. There is a working steam donkey of the Dolbear type preserved at Fort Humboldt in Eureka, the very country where Dolbear first tried his out. And on certain days they still fire it up, and it still hisses and turns its spool and pulls, 140 years after the first one. You can stand there and watch the exact kind of machine that ended the age of the ox in the American forest, still doing the one thing it was born to do. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We usually tell the history of machines as a story of pure progress, each invention better than the last, and in the narrow sense that is true. The donkey engine really was better than the ox, faster and cheaper and stronger. But better at what is the question I keep coming back to. It was better at cutting down the largest and oldest trees on the planet, faster than they could ever grow back. John Dolbear was a brilliant, practical man who solved the hardest problem his industry faced, and the men who ran his machines, donkey punchers and choker setters, and the boys on the whistle wire were doing dangerous, skilled, honest work for a wage. None of them were villains, and the machine was a genuine marvel of homemade American engineering. And yet the better the machine got, faster the great forests fell. I think the steam donkey is one of those inventions that should make us admire human ingenuity, and also be careful what we point it at, because we are very good at building tools that can do a thing far faster than we can ever undo it. Stand in one of the saved redwood groves today, in the green hush under trees that were already old when Rome was young, and then picture that little 4-ton engine hissing and snorting and dragging their cut neighbors out of the woods, log after log, day after day, for 50 years. The trees took 2,000 years to grow. The machine could clear a slope of them in a season. That is the whole of it. Genius and the warning in a single picture, a brilliant little engine and a forest that could not grow back fast enough to outrun it. John Dolbear built a better way to do a thing, the way good engineers always do. What a people chooses to point that better way at is a separate question, and a harder one, and it is still, a century and a half later, ours to answer. Dolbear gave the country a tireless mechanical ox, and it was a genuine wonder. He could not give it the wisdom to know where to stop, and as it turned out, neither could anyone else in time to save most of the great trees. The engine did exactly what it was built to do. That was the marvel of it, and that was the trouble with it. And both of those are still true today. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.